Who was the first modern president, you ask? Put a question to historians, presidential scholars, and on most matters, you'll get a hot debate. But this is one where there wouldn't be a whole lot of debate. Nearly all would agree that the first recognizably modern president was Theodore Roosevelt. And here's why. During the 19th century, during the 18th and 19th centuries, presidents were usually not particularly important and not particularly remarkable. And one of the reasons for this was that the Constitution was designed that way. That's part of it. But another large part of it had to do with the fact that presidents during that period didn't have a whole lot to do. Because presidents, being the chief executive officer of the United States, largely execute the will of Congress. They sign measures into law. Maybe they veto. Occasionally they veto, and then it goes back and go from there. But largely they react, or I should say, they reacted to what Congress did. There was one area, though, from the beginning that was peculiarly the president's area of responsibility, and that was war and things that might lead up to war, namely foreign policy. So presidents, from the beginning, had distinctive authority over foreign policy. But during the 18th and 19th century, the United States didn't have a lot of foreign policy for presidents to engage in. There were long periods of time when not much happened in foreign policy. Yeah, there were moments. In the first 20 years, the United States was chronically troubled by the European War between Britain and France, and presidents had to deal with that. And then there was the question of territorial expansion. So Jefferson did purchase Louisiana, and James Polk engineered a war to acquire California. But with the exception of that, foreign policy just did not figure largely in American affairs. Now, we could discuss whether policy toward American Indians, toward the Native Americans, should be counted as foreign policy. In fact, it wasn't considered at the time, and so we'll go with that particular definition. But it wasn't considered foreign policy in the same way that policy toward France or Britain or Mexico, for that matter. Because sort of foreign policy was, can you find an autonomous other government? And with Native American tribes, there wasn't a government like the government one found in London or in Paris or Mexico City. So the United States was engaged in relations with the native tribes, but they were considered sort of domestic dependent nations rather than foreign nations. Anyway, with all that said, presidents didn't have much foreign policy to deal with because the United States was separated from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean. And for the longest time, that kept the United States from having to worry about the affairs of Europe. The Pacific Ocean to America's west is even wider, and Americans paid even less attention to what was going on in Asia. Yes, there were issues between the United States and Mexico, and there was the war between the United States and Mexico in the 1840s. But again, these are intermittent things. For the most part, presidents didn't have to engage in foreign policy, and that one area of American political life that the president has most responsibility for was largely quiescent. Things changed at the very end of the 19th century when the United States acquired an overseas empire, colonies, especially in the Philippines on the far side of the Pacific. Because at that moment, for the president, for the United States, foreign policy became a full-time affair. Other countries didn't operate on America's political schedule. During the 19th century, when Congress was not in session, and in those days Congress was not in session almost as much as it was in session, presidents could go home. Andrew Jackson could take a 3 or 4 month vacation and go back to Tennessee. And Washington would hardly be aware that he wasn't there. But once the United States jumps into that arena, that world of international affairs, then that world never sleeps. And a crisis might develop between the United States and Japan, say, over the Philippines. Or it was at the same time that the United States, under Theodore Roosevelt, became very invested in building a canal in Panama. So At the beginning of the 20th century, just about the moment Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, Theodore Roosevelt becomes president upon the death of William McKinley in 1901, so we're just within a year's framework here, the United States has this full-time foreign policy. So part of the reason the presidency is yanked into the modern age is the United States, for the first time, has this full-time foreign policy. So that's part of the reason. Now, a second reason is there were changes in technology. The technology, especially of communications, the technology of the media. The primary medium, the medium through which people got most of their news in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, in fact, until the 1930s, was newspapers. And new technology for printing newspapers made it possible to sell mass circulation newspapers, to sell the papers for a penny. Now, actually, they cost more to produce than a penny, but advertising covered the difference. And newspapers, daily newspapers, competing for circulation. They were looking for arresting stories. They wanted things that they could report on that would grab the attention of ordinary readers, people who didn't spend all their time thinking about policy issues, but ordinary people. And it became a whole lot easier for these papers to write stories about individuals. The individual, for, say, the president, rather than about the workings of Congress. Congress is this committee, and reporting on committees is really boring. It's hard to get a handle on. But the presidency, there's one person here. You can focus on one person. So just at this moment, the medium of choice of the day is looking for these kind of stories that it can tell, and they can tell them most effectively about a single individual. And then the third part of this equation is the personality of that individual. Theodore Roosevelt was this arresting personality. Theodore Roosevelt was somebody who was actually interesting his whole life. I happen to write a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and when I was writing the biography of Theodore Roosevelt, he was just as interesting. In fact, he was often more interesting when he wasn't president than when he was president. So he was just this guy who had an eye for what would grab attention. He always had to be the center of attention. His daughter once said, if you want to understand my father, you have to remember that he has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Well, this was exactly the kind of person who could make use of this new medium and whom the new medium could make use of. So it was almost this marriage made in heaven when these newspaper editors are looking for somebody they can tell stories about. And there is this guy now at the center of American politics who can generate the stories that they can tell stories about. So this is a great marriage. And then one last thing, and it also has to do with technology, and that is, by the beginning of the 20th century, it was possible for a president to be president pretty much 24 hours a day, every day of the year. So when Theodore Roosevelt would take his summer vacations to the family home at Sagamore Hill on Long Island in New York, or when he would go out west, he liked to go hunting and hiking, do all this stuff, then the sort of the necessary stuff for being president could follow him. He was never far from a telegraph office, and the telegraph, or by this time, the telephone, and so he could keep up with events. In most of the 19th century, if a president was away from Washington, then the president was away from the news and all the information he needed to be president. By the 20th century, it was possible to be president from just about anywhere that president might choose to be. So from this combination of factors, a full-time foreign policy, changes in the media, technology, communications technology, and this personality that could fill the newspapers, could fill the medium of the day. Theodore Roosevelt really was the first modern president. I'll say one other thing, and that is not everybody who came along after Theodore Roosevelt had that kind of personality, that stage-filling personality. But because expectations of the presidency had changed by then, people who did have that kind of personality became more likely to be president than was the case in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it was hard to have a retiring personality and be president. Occasionally you get someone like Calvin Coolidge, who accidentally made his way into the office on the death of his predecessor. But for the most part, to be even considered presidential material. You had to have this kind of big personality that could fill the stage that had been first occupied by Theodore Roosevelt.